Hi again. Okay, this is the second portion of my little explanatory lecture on the Chinese traditions of Taoism and Confucianism. I promise I'll be a little more brief on this portion. The other one was a little bit longer than a half an hour. So I'll try to keep this one to about 15 minutes or so. We'll see how that works out. But let's talk about the figure of Confucius. Just briefly, a little bit, about him, and then really what his solution was to lack of Tao or lack of harmony. It's interesting with Confucius that he does talk about Tao, although he says for humans, Tao is something different. For trees and for birds, they can follow instinct and just grow and develop and do what trees do and do what birds do. But for human beings, the Tao entails a moral dimension to our lives, and we have to cultivate that. And the way that we can do that is through social interaction, through fulfilling our obligations to one another, starting with our families, our extended families, and then our communities at large, our society at large. And through self-cultivation, primarily through education. But as we'll see, education for Confucius is a broader subject than might at first seem. And so let's talk a little bit about Confucius. You have his dates here. If you're on the slide that says Confucian themes, you have a little illustration of Confucius. One thing to understand about the name Confucius, that's a Latinized form of his Chinese name and title. He's usually referred to as Kong Tzu, Master Kong, like Lao Tzu is Master Lao Tzu, being an honorary title that's appended to the Chinese name. Confucius is the longer name, including his family name. And this really comes from Roman Catholic missionaries, Jesuits who show up in China starting in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. Father Matteo Ricci was one of the noteworthy Jesuit missionaries to China. He learned the Chinese language. He took on the Chinese dress and style of life, although he was a lifelong Catholic and Christian missionary. With the blessing of the Pope, excuse me, when the Jesuit fathers visited China, they were enamored with the fact that Chinese civilization was, in some cases, at a higher level of development even than Italian society or Western European society, Christian society at that time, if you think of the end of the Renaissance. And so one of the questions that Father Matteo and the Jesuit fathers asked the Chinese diplomats, the envoys of the emperor, they would say, "We are Christians. We follow the teachings of our Master, our Lord Jesus Christ. What is it and who is it primarily that you follow?" And invariably the Chinese nobility and the diplomats at that time would respond with, "We follow the teachings of Confucius, of Master Kong." And so some of these Jesuit fathers then learned the Chinese language, and ultimately the Analects, or the sayings attributed to Confucius, were translated into the Latin language and became accessible for European scholars, primarily in the Catholic Church, but then outside of the Catholic Church as well. And so the teachings of Confucius then did have some influence later outside of Chinese civilization on European society, at least intellectuals, especially in the Catholic Church. So remember that Confucius and Confucianism is really a Latinized form of Confucius's name and title, Confucius. His dates are here, 551 to 479 BCE. He came from a noble family, but he was the son of his elderly father's second wife. And the first wife could only provide a series of daughters to Confucius's father, his biological father. And there was a son from the first wife, but he had some sort of a physical or possibly a mental handicap. He's referred to as an invalid, and we really don't know 100%, what that was. But it was something that where he couldn't become the heir of the biological father. And so in old age, Confucius's father, when he was around 70 years old, sounds very, very old, and it was, both for then and for now, conscripted a second wife, and so she was considerably younger than Confucius's father. And so his father dies after his Confucius's mother gives birth to him, and he's an infant. He's about maybe a toddler. He's about 3 years old, I think, 2 or 3 years old when his biological father passes away. And in a sense, the second wife was ostracized, was never accepted by the first wife and their family. And so in a sense, she's a single mother. She's vulnerable, and she has to work menial tasks, probably as a washerwoman, so that she can provide for her son's tutoring and for her son's education. And that really sticks with Confucius in later life, because he realizes where he comes from, and he realizes the sacrifice of his mother and the sacrifices that she made. And she dies relatively young. She dies when Confucius is about 20, and he's just moving into his first government post as a young man in his early 20s when his mother physically passes away. So she was probably about 40-ish, 40 probably, when she passes away. And yet that sticks with him, the idea that she wanted doors to be open to him, and so she worked hard and struggled hard so that she could provide for teachers and for tutors so that he could have an education and become somebody in a sense. Important thing to realize about Confucius is that he believes that each person is capable of being good. So he might agree with the Taoists to a certain extent, but he says this can't be achieved in isolation. So he's very skeptical of the hermit's way. The person who goes off and meditates in the woods. And he probably would be very skeptical of the story of the Buddha, although he would not have had any knowledge of Siddhartha or that, because that was the message of Buddhism was brought to China centuries after the time that Confucius lived. But he would be skeptical of leaving the family behind in a sense, and following the mystic path. Confucius's response to lack of harmony in his society is a breakdown in the moral structure. And that really starts with the extended family. So according to Confucius, in the society that he's living in, Junzi was literally the son of the Lord, or son of a master. And that was the idea in feudal society, that lineage was very important, and that property, family, household, possessions, etc., were passed along hereditary lines. And so at the time of Confucius, one became a noble simply by accident of birth. My daddy's the prince, and therefore I'm going to be a prince, etc., dynastic succession. And Confucius radically alters that idea. He says, no, one becomes junzi through becoming a gentleman, through cultivating oneself. And that's when you can call yourself the son of the Lord, in a sense, a noble person, a nobleman, to use the term in its historical context. 2,500 years ago, we're talking about male lineages for the most part. And so for Confucius, you become noble by fulfilling your obligations, social obligations, family obligations to your parents, your elders, your teachers, your friends, your older brother, your older sister, your ancestors, those who are departed and who have paved the way for you, and then to your government ministers, to the emperor himself or to the king. And the way you do this is you cultivate your virtue and your intellect, and therefore for Confucius, education is essential to self-cultivation and ultimately becoming a complete or a full human being, a noble person. Now, education for Confucius is not just mathematics and science, what we would call science, physical physics, natural philosophy, etc. It would incorporate that, book learning, literacy, writing, but it includes more than that. It includes what we would now refer to as the liberal arts, right? Poetry, painting, music composition, and playing an instrument, for example, would all be important parts of this educational curriculum. Manners. One of the things that you would do at the time of Confucius, and then obviously in the Confucian tradition following Confucius, as a scholar, you would simply, as a young person, follow your teacher around. If he goes to the marketplace, if he meets with a diplomat, you might not open your mouth, you might not say anything, but you would slowly begin to imbibe or digest the actions of your master, of your teacher, and you would act the way that he acts. And thereby you would cultivate your manners. You would know how to act appropriately in the setting of a diplomat, in the setting of court musicians. You wouldn't act out of place. You wouldn't crack jokes and insult people and sort of make yourself the center of the party or the life of the party. That would not be something that you would want to cultivate. And then something that's important, religiously speaking, is referred to by Confucius and by other sources as li. And this incorporates the religious ritual, predominantly visiting the tombs of one's ancestors, one's departed family members, sweeping the grave, dusting it off, honoring the ancestors, honoring your departed ones, forging that link with the unseen world, with the spirit, the world of the spirits, making offerings, offering incense, burning incense and prayers. This is all a part of acting appropriately in a Confucian way, and forging that strong bond, not just between the living friends, teachers, parents, cousins, etc., but with the departed, and therefore ensuring harmony with the departed spirits. And so that plays a big role. And it also teaches us educationally how to act appropriately, reverentially, and going through life with a sense of gravity, with a sense of humanity and humaneness. And that's very important for Confucius. Sorry, I jumped here. Some Confucian quotations. Okay, now this first one is from the Analects, from Lun Yu in Chinese, Book 1. And Confucius many times is referred to by his disciples simply as the master. And so here, the master said, "Is it not a pleasure to learn? And when it is timely to practice what you have learned? Is it not gentlemanly not to become resentful if no one takes notice of your learning?" So we have a couple of dimensions here of Confucius's teaching. He's saying, it's pleasurable to learn. Right there, on a basic, essential level, there's a pleasure to cultivating your intellect, reading a book, interacting with others and engaging their ideas, and in a sense, broadening your perspective. So that's pleasurable. And then on a second level, on a deeper level, when it is timely to practice what you have learned. Here again, we have this emphasis in these East Asian religions on practice. It's not so much what you know, but what you practice that leaves a good example in your wake for others to follow. So that's kind of a deeper level behind learning, at least according to Confucius here. And then he says he takes it, ratchets it up to a third level, supreme level, right? The junzi, the gentleman, the noble. Is it not noble not to become resentful if no one takes notice of your learning? So he's saying that, in a sense, even if you're not recognized or you're not honored for your learning by society, nevertheless, it's gentlemanly, it's noble, it's more noble of you, not to be angry when people don't recognize your scholarly acumen, your intellectual prowess, your learning, so to speak. And he would say on an ethical level, this would include, when you open the door for somebody at McDonald's, right? A lot of times they'll say, "Oh, hey, thanks," right? And oh, okay, great, no problem. And that makes you feel good. But even if you were to open the door for someone and the person didn't even recognize that you existed, they didn't bother to thank you, they just went in and cut in front of you in line and ordered their lunch. Confucius is saying that it's noble not to become resentful at that point, to simply act ethically and act nobly because it's the right thing to do, as opposed to being recognized for that. That's a very difficult thing to practice. And then this is from a different document called The Great Society, or The Great Community, or Commonality. Notice that he mentions Tao in this quotation. Sounds like a Taoist, but he locates Tao in a different place, as you'll see. When the great Tao prevails, Confucius says, the world is a commonwealth in which rulers are selected according to their wisdom and ability. Mutual confidence is promoted and good neighborliness cultivated. Sounds like Mr. Rogers there. Hence, men do not regard as parents only their own parents, nor do they treat as children only their own children. This is what we call the great commonality. Notice for Confucius, he's saying a couple of things here. He's saying that we can talk about the great Tao prevailing when we rise above our blood connection here, our genetic connection. When we regard all the parents as if they were our own biological parents. When we regard all the children on the playground and treat them as if they were our own children. That's a difficult thing to put into practice. But also that the rulers themselves should be selected according to wisdom and ability and self-cultivation, and not simply because they're the son of a king or the son of a prince. And that was a difficult message for rulers to hear at the time of Confucius, and not all of them accepted his teachings. So here's my summation of these two sages of human nature. They focus on one's place in nature and in society. And both of them, Lao Tzu has things to say about rulership, about military figures. So he does have something to say about society. Confucius is also talking about the great Tao, as we've seen. And so he's concerned with producing harmony, especially on a social level, on a family level. And they really complement each other in a sense. And China, historically speaking, really sees itself as benefiting primarily from Confucius and Confucianism and Taoism and Lao Tzu and the teachings of Master Lao and the later Taoist sages, religiously and spiritually speaking. So I've sort of summed these up. Confucius's contribution is the idea of reciprocity, his version of the golden rule. Don't do to the other person what you would not want them to do to you. In other words, pondering the consequences of your actions on others before you enact them. Slamming the door in someone's face, that might be funny, and there might be kind of a short-lived reward from behavior like that, but ultimately it's going to have a ripple effect on the community at large. And so this idea that you want to do unto others as you would have them do unto you is something that Confucius and Confucianism focuses on, morally speaking. Reciprocity, the mutuality of our common actions, respecting others, being benevolent, acting in a cultivated way, in a respectful way, with an emphasis on continual learning and self-cultivation. And really the root, in English at least, the root of cultivation is similar with the word culture. When we talk about high culture, oh, so-and-so's got culture, right? He listens to all of this music, or he knows a lot about wine, or he or she, they're art critics, they're cultured in a sense, not because they're high class, but remember, Confucius is going to locate this. Are you cultivated? Are you self-cultivated? Do you have a moral sense of obligation? Do you act with a social sense and a communal sense? Do you look out for others as if they were members of your family? Lao Tzu, Master Lao, his contribution, and Taoism specifically, self-reflection. He follows the inner path, the mystic path, the path of the prophet and the seer, right? He's looking for that inner voice, that inner guidance. And realize that in Taoism, the Tao is not something that we need to construct. It's something that already exists. It's there in nature. It's the way that life flows. And so we simply need to find our niche, so to speak, our place, and be comfortable with that. And like water, simply flow around obstacles when they come into our path. Improvement. There's always room for improvement in Lao Tzu's understanding. There's a critique in Taoism generally of artificiality. That what's in it for me attitude. Maybe I'll help my buddy as long as 6 months from now I can ask him to help me. Okay, and the Taoists are saying, can't we supersede that? Can't we move beyond that and simply be childlike and embrace the world? And therefore there's an openness to the spontaneity of life and saying, hey, this is interesting. Even in adverse situations, what can I learn about myself? What can I learn about my family? What can I learn about my community? Instead of just reacting negatively and saying, oh, the weather sucks, or oh, we're on quarantine and we can't go to the movies right now. We can't interact with each other socially speaking. And so Lao Tzu is saying, can you make lemonade out of lemons, so to speak? And in this is an emphasis on finding your own path. And that's a liberating thing in a sense. Like water, seeking your own level, finding your own way. Maybe your neighbor's way is not your way. Maybe you're more independent in that sense, and you think of yourself as a seeker. And so Lao Tzu and the Taoists are saying that there's something good to that. There's something in finding your own place and your own path and being comfortable in your own skin. And ultimately, once you find your inner place and your inner path, you're going to be harmonious with the world in a sense. It kind of just clicks. The final slide I have here, I have 3 questions for you. I'm going to open up a discussion page in the discussions area. I'll probably just have a tab on the course menu, and it will say Taoism and Confucianism, questions for class discussion, or something like that. And so if we were in the classroom this week, I would write these 3 questions up on the board. I'd match you up with a partner like we've done in the past. And I would want you not to ride the fence here. Trust your intuition on this. And which side do you lean more towards? Question number 1. At this point in your life, do you see yourself generally as more on the independent side? You trust yourself, you're more on your own as you find yourself in your current life? Or are you more on the dependent side, or at least reliant on others and other people? Question number 2, when you look at the world at large, is our world more on the friendly side, or at least helpful? Therefore, is it something to be embraced? Or is it more on the hostile side, or antagonistic? Is it slanted against you in a sense? And therefore, is it something to be shunned, or at least kept at arm's length, so to speak? Again, try to lean towards one side or the other. And then ultimately, the question that concerns human nature here from a philosophical and a religious perspective, you've been exposed now to 2 different responses, the Taoist one and the Confucian one. But in your view, personally speaking, is human nature, when you look at humanity as a whole, generally speaking, again, this is a generalization, but do you view human nature as more on the good side? Should we leave people alone? Should we practice non-interference as much as we possibly can, and live and let live? Or, in your view, is human nature bad, or at least in some ways flawed? It's imperfect. It's therefore people are in need of salvation or deliverance, and they need inculcated in them a strong sense of right and wrong, and hence the teacher's path here, right? So I will open this up for you at some point this week. These 3 questions I'll put in a discussion area, and I will want you to creatively respond on this. Try to stay away from simple kind of 1-word or 2-word phrases, and be creative and expressive in defending yourself here. Yes, I'm more independent, or yes, I'm more dependent because, and state your reasons. And this will be figured into your overall participation score. I'm hoping that we can do at least one of these per week. That might be a bit ambitious, but this is a big and important part of our class, and I've discussed this over the phone with Professor Matter. And so we think it's important to at least have you continuing in these discussions and answering these philosophical and these religious questions. So take this seriously, and again, I hope you're well and you're cultivating yourselves with the time that is in your hands. So stay safe, and we're looking forward to continuing the semester of our learning community in this exclusively online format. Thank you, and take care.